I'm Alexandra Levy. I'm here today with Dr. Avner Cohen. It is May 30th, 2018 in Washington, D.C. And my first question is to please say your name and spell it.
I'm Avner Cohen, A-V-N-E-R, first name, last name Cohen, C-O-H-E-N.
If you could tell us where and when you were born.
I was born in Israel in the early 50s, the city of Tel Aviv.
Great. So if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your career, how you got into nuclear issues.
Well, briefly, everybody can tell his or her story as long as they want to go. Currently, I'm a professor for non-proliferation studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey for the last 7 years. But I see myself very much as a scholar of the nuclear age. And I think that a great deal of my professional life, even though I was trained as a philosopher, have been shifted to study quite a variety of aspects of the nuclear age, with a great deal of focus on the unique case of Israel. I've been doing it since, I would say, since the early 80s. So by now it's about 35 years. As I said, I was trained as a philosopher. I got my PhD at the University of Chicago. But very soon, after my first year as a visiting assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis, I got a call. This was 1981, 82. I think it was in the spring of 82. I got a call from close colleague of mine, he still is, a philosopher named Stephen Lee, and Stephen has a lot of time also interest in nuclear age. And this was in the midst of the anti-nuclear movement, and Steve kind of out of the blue said, Avner, what about us doing something jointly about the philosophical foundations, the moral issues involved in this anti-nuclear movement of the early 80s. I must admit that I was on normal track of, converting PhD dissertation into a book. That's very common practice. And almost without hesitation, that means that I'm going to change what I'm doing and to change essentially my life ultimately. I told him, yes, let's do that. The result was a book that was edited by the two of us called Nuclear Weapons and the Future of Humanity. It came out in 1986, so we worked on that book for about 4 years. A large volume that we solicit articles from all sorts of people who were involved in various aspects of the nuclear age. Scientists, philosophers, historians, others. And I read into that. In retrospect, I thought there was something, how should I put it, in my genes perhaps, or something in me that was ready to change and to move into that. I had a certain kind of dissatisfaction about the state of philosophy. And I think the challenge of thinking about nuclear weapons and the meaning of living under the shadow of the bomb was something that was close to my heart, perhaps also for deeper reasons I understood at the time. Later I learned that my father, my late father right now, thought a great deal about it. I mean, it was for him almost the question whether to marry and to have children in a world with nuclear weapons. I was born in 1951. My dad was a veteran of World War II, so he was part of the generation that saw, so to speak, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It had profound impact on him. I still recall the time that we heard on the radio that Israel has its own reactor, which was, everybody understood it's not just reactor, it's more than that. It's most likely about security, about weapons. So it was a theme that was in the house when I was a child. And I kind of responded back to the same theme. And when I said yes to my friend Stephen Lee, when he asked me to do that, I really changed my life. The result was that essentially I didn't do standard philosophy. I left philosophy. I gave a series of lectures on the Israeli radio on the nuclear age from moral and historical perspectives. The nuclear age is a moral history. I spent many years to study the Israeli case and to find my own voice about it. It took me perhaps almost 8 or 9 years to work on that. Ultimately came out with a book, Israel and the Bomb. It took me another decade to work out with another book dealing with the uniqueness of the Israeli case and the very way that Israel has resolved or not resolved, depends how you're going to call it, with its own unique way of having the bomb but not talking about it. The policy of opacity, or Amimut in Hebrew. And indeed, in the last 7 or 8 years, I'm a professor of non-proliferation studies, and I do primarily history and morality and Israel at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. So that's, in a nutshell, my intellectual history.
That's great.
Maybe I can add one more thing, that to do historical work on the Israeli case, it was not a simple thing. I had to struggle and to deal with, to address very powerful forces that did not want the story to be out. Some top powerful bureaucrats. I had to deal with the social, societal taboos, and it was not a simple thing. Ultimately, I defied, by now I'm both Israeli and American citizen, but I defied the Israeli regulation. I did not submit my book to the censor, ultimately. I had a case before that in the Israeli Supreme Court. So the whole writing a book on Israel was not just the intellectual issue of doing history, but it was also struggling with institutions and forces who were committed to do their best not to let the story come out. So it was a struggle.
So how did you go about conducting research and writing Israel and the Bomb? I know you conducted a lot of oral histories.
Correct.
So can you talk a little about that?
Yeah. When you have very limited direct sources, archival, documentary-based sources, and you want to do history, you cannot just rely on clips in the media or some superficial archives, especially that you have so little from Israeli sources. You may have some you can find in various files of the State Department or Pentagon in the US National Archive. Maybe you can go to the UK archives, to Norwegians, but very limited information you can find from the makers themselves, from the Israelis. So I decided to do that by oral history. I've been always aware of the limits of oral history. In fact, one of the cases I'm going to talk about it tomorrow here in Washington, it's the story about 1967. Maybe we'll talk about a little bit about it. So I've been always aware of the limits of oral history. We're talking about one person. We're talking about sometimes decades from the events. We're talking about subjectivity. We're talking about the fact that, the forgetfulness of things and the very selective way that you remember things, the limits of memory and all that. I'm fully aware of the limits of that. I'm also fully aware of the limits of documentary. I don't believe that the final truth is in the archive. It's lovely to have access to archive, but I don't believe that the whole history is there. In a way, the search for historical truth is never ending, because historical truth could be found in all sorts of ways, and we don't really have criteria to know that what is fully constituted. We don't have any template for the truth. So I decided to interview a lot of people. Given my own background, and I had some access to various kind of people because of my own upbringing, I grew up in kind of the elite of the Israeli society at the time in the 60s, military elite. I was able to find some people who were ready to talk to me, not all. I got quite a number of rejections, people who were not ready to talk to me. But I had a few sources that were fantastic sources. I wish I had more. I wish you can always wish to have more. Some of them are people that I kept connections for years, in some cases even for decades. In some cases even people until they died. And I was trying to put elements together. I always took oral history with some salt, and often I put the insight actually in the footnotes. That's the reason why sometimes you have a rich footnotes rather than the body of the study itself. So ultimately, I interviewed somewhere over for that book, Israel in the Bomb, over 150 individuals in the United States, in Israel, in Norway, in the UK, and in France, including Goldschmidt, that we may talk about. I can also say that I got some rejections, and I think that my trouble with the Israeli authorities started when some people who refused to talk to me felt the need to report to somebody else, to security, that somebody is asking dangerous questions. So I think shortly after I started, I think it was the summer of 1992, when I started to ask the first questions, I got also a call or a visit of somebody from the defense establishment or the security establishment. What are you doing? And a question like that, and the story goes from there.
So did you find that the people that you interviewed were generally forthcoming and gave you accurate information?
Some. I encountered the limits of memory. I encountered some sources were fantastic and were trying to retrieve their own memory for me. Some people, I was amazed how fragile the memory could be and how limited the memory could be. I learned, which is not surprising, that very often people remember from meetings, from encounters, just the personal, emotional, outside side, but the substance of the conversation, the issue, even the decision that were taken, those are often being forgotten. So I learned quickly that memories are different. Some are great, some are terrible. By the way, my own memory is not the best necessarily. I learned that too. And I learned also about how you need to be prepared for an interview. You need to read a great deal before that about the subject, about the context. And, but, I've done that. I spent about 2 or 3 years primarily in the research that includes a great deal of oral history.
So how was Israel and the Bomb received when it was published?
I think by scholars it was the first time that there was, and I think there was an agreement, or near agreement about that. This was the first history that was based on a serious research and an effort to reach out for answers of a lot of issues that were put aside, that you could not. So people recognized that there was a lot of original, historical, and even philosophical or meta-historical insight about that particular story, the story of how Israel pursued the bomb. I got largely outside Israel very positive reviews. In Israel, I got very soon the request to have an Hebrew translation by Shoken, quite respectable press. And but when the book came out and it was supposed to have a special kind of release with a lot of media coverage, I was told that if I'll fly to Israel, I may be arrested, and the arrangement that the publisher thought, the legal arrangement about my status, would fall apart, and they recommended me not to come. So we did the first interview for the publication of the book via satellites from here, Washington. It was in 1998. So the book, the book came out in 1998 in the English version. It came in the Hebrew edition in 2000, I believe. And for that, the interview for that edition, for that Hebrew edition, I couldn't be there. I had to do it through, because it was clear that I'm likely to be arrested. And the fight, just to mention that, the fight was in the eyes of the security defense establishment. The fear was that if they cannot handle me, and they knew that I did not reveal anything truly sensitive, locations, processes, names, or any of that. But the concern was, if the policy of Amimut is broken and Israeli source tells factual history about that story, what we're going to do with it later. So it was very much in their mind. I have different interpretation. I don't think that they took it too seriously, but if they cannot handle me, the whole policy would collapse. They didn't handle me, and the policy did not collapse. The policy remains today. I think the practice around the policies have changed a little bit, but they were afraid, or some of the top leaders were afraid, that they need to show others, they need to warn others not to talk, and they cannot let it go as if nothing happened. So they must do something with me to stop me. They tried to stop the publication of the book. That's failed, and then the issue was how to punish me, if punishment makes sense. Ultimately, I was not punished. I was interrogated to resolve that issue for many, many hours, not continuously in steps. And the issue, ultimately, there was any indictment, any persecution against me. I think this was a smart decision. It wouldn't serve them to try to do, because it would publicize exactly the kind of thing that they want to prevent. But it was a very long interrogation. It took quite a number of years until the issue disappeared. And I think that by now I have been immunized, and I am not treated anymore. I mean, in part because I'm, for a while, American citizen. I don't live in Israel anymore, so I paid a certain kind of price. But in part because I became a special case in the mind of the security services.
Maybe this would be a good point for you to provide kind of an overview of Israel's development of the bomb and the policy of the Amimut.
I mean, Israel is a very unique case in the nuclear age. It's the sixth nations to have acquired nuclear weapons. And yet, its mode of acquisition, its mode of possession of nuclear weapon is fundamentally different, and in more than one way, from all others. All others, secretly pursue nuclear weapons. When they got it, that there was a test. Sooner or later, the test became known, and it became known that they have nuclear weapons, and it became declaratory part of, and there was some kind of doctrine, and so operational secrecy remained on some specific issues, but the very basic fact that the country has nuclear weapons became known. This was the case with the first five. All of them are now the nuclear weapons official states, part of the recognized nuclear weapons state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But this was also the story of others who came after Israel. I'm talking about, in particular, India and Pakistan. The only case that was like Israel, mimicked to some extent Israel, was South Africa, but South Africa was a short-lived case. It was a case of states that decided to have nuclear weapons, had a very few nuclear weapons, 6.5 actually, half I'm saying because the seventh was not completed, and ultimately was for less than a decade. It was dismantled when South Africa left the apartheid regime. Israel is the only case of a country that has developed and by now possess a significant arsenal of nuclear weapons. Some of it is believed to be in the form of actual, almost fully assembled nuclear weapons. They may not be fully assembled, but almost fully assembled. Technically, it could be a matter of hours to put it together. And probably some reserves of weapons-grade material. So it's, for all practical purposes, it is nuclear weapons. It has significant command and control system. And yet Israel has not conducted a test that was recognized by other countries as a test. There is one case of suspicion, what happened in South Africa in September 1979. And Israel has never declared to have. Israel has made up a very strange declaratory stance, saying that Israel will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons, refusing to say anything factual about what they do and what they don't do. So it's a very unique case. It's a country that everybody believes by now, including Israelis, and they're talking about it more openly than before, even though technically they cannot say it in writing without reference to foreign sources, that Israel is a nuclear weapon state. And yet there are limits on the discourse, there are limits on the knowledge, the country has never acknowledged, and there was no test that's acceptable by others, and if there was a test, probably there was a series of a few tests at one point, and that's it. There were. So Israel developed a system to be in a possession of nuclear weapons without some of the features, let alone the most important features, self-declaration, some kind of pronouncement that the nation has nuclear weapons. That's a very strange thing. That's to have it and not to have it, to have it but to feel not to have it. I mean, there is something profoundly, I would call it schizophrenic, about that kind of capability. And I believe it reflects, and I think it's not just a tactics to hide, because everybody, it's as I called my last book, the worst kept secret. It is the worst kept secret. Everybody knows that. So partially it's a political strategy. But I believe that it reflects something deeper than just political strategy or even strategic device to manage in a region that you would like to keep monopoly, but without a situation that your monopoly would trigger arms race of others. Arms race could be, others could be Egypt. And at one time they wanted to have weapons, no more. Iraq, at one time they wanted to have weapons, no more. To some degree it's because of Iraq invasion to Kuwait and the US response, but ultimately it was under the UN that Iraq was not allowed to. Syria, Israel did not allow Syria to have nuclear weapons. Also in the Iraq, the early case, Israel bombed the nuclear facility in Iraq, in Al-Thuwaitha. So Israel was able to manage a strategy of monopoly. And that policy was very instrumental for that. That policy was a way to divert criticism, so it was a political strategy. But I think there was something even deeper than just that, deeper than tactics, deeper than just strategy, even though it played a role, different than just politics of non-proliferation, to have less pressure, almost no pressure. And there was also an American angle, the fact that Israel and the United States got a deal under which the United States, under President Nixon in 1969, became Israel enablers. Essentially, without that US support, Israel could not have succeeded with having that kind of stance. But what I'm trying to say is I believe that the depth of the Israeli unique stance of to have and not to have is reflection of something deeper, something in the Israeli psyche that had to do with anxiety about Holocaust and Holocaust as playing a role for both inertia and momentum and resolve on the technology side, and at the same time inhibitions on what you say, what you behave, on your diplomacy, on the diplomacy side. So constraints. And let me explain that, because there is a very interesting dilemma that I think the dilemma has some strategic, some political, but it also has some psychological. It reflects why Israel ultimately became, to some extent, hesitant about nuclear weapons. On the technology side is fully resolved. On the political diplomatic side, it doesn't want to see itself as having full nuclear weapons. So let me explain that. In a way, the Holocaust and the commitment never again, the Holocaust essentially is the most traumatic event in Jewish history, where 6 million Jews, at that time it was maybe 40% of the Jewish people at the time, were perished. And the commitment never again to happen, it involves that if we had nuclear weapons at the time, which is of course it's counterfactual and just kind of wishful thinking, it would be strong then, it would never happen. By the way, think about it, that just a few years ago, and it was something very moving and very emotional, even though it was not directly about nuclear weapons, Israeli F-15 flew over Auschwitz with Israeli piloting. It was, and some of the pilots were survivors, children of survivors, and some of them were talking through the communication. It was clear there was tears in their eyes. So the commitment never again means that in order to prevent another Auschwitz, we must be in position to threaten explicitly, implicitly, but to have the capability to do what was done in Hiroshima. That will prevent, that will deter another Auschwitz. We must be strong ourselves. This was the imperative to be strong, the imperative that led technology, that ultimately with that imperative in mind, Israel's first prime minister, when the country was extremely poor, in the first decade of its life, when the country absorbed so many new immigrants, it's almost the same number that there were in the country, about 650,000 in 1948, and that within 3 or 4 years absorbed some other 750,000. And yet, within the first decade, by 1950, he thought about it, Ben-Gurion, already in 1948. And he was inspired by the Manhattan Project and by the Jews who were playing a leading role in the Manhattan Project. And within a decade, he ordered to start to look for the possibility. So it was the imperative that survival in this hostile area, small against the many, few against the many, in that hostile area, we don't have any chance to get a guarantee from anybody else, but from ourselves. Ourselves means science, we are few against the many, nuclear weapons make sense. This was very powerful. This was non-hesitant. This was thinking in a very concrete way to achieve within a decade. So essentially the ideas were in 1955. The starting of the project was with the deal with the France in 1957. The beginning of the Dimona nuclear complex was 58, 59. And by the eve of the 67 war, Israel had something, very embryonic, very rudimentary device, but explosive device that could be shown. Not fully weapon, not something that you can put on missile, on aircraft, but something that perhaps a device you can bring somewhere and demonstrates capability. So this is the resolve to go for it, to have it. At the same time, But by other group of people, there was people who say, we should never do that. Nuclearizing the region, we will never be able to keep ourselves alone. Others will have it too. If others have it too, even if for a while we have it alone, monopoly, if others have it too, then the whole monopoly, then the whole, it's from invincibility, from being powerful, you become vulnerable. Because Israel is more sensitive, is more vulnerable, because it's small, because its population is small. One bomb, God forbid, will be the end of the Zionist project. One bomb over Tel Aviv. And the belief was that there is no way to have it for the long run ourselves alone. So they didn't believe that monopoly would be only temporal. So the view was, we should always be in a position to be ahead of the other side, but it's not our interest to nuclearize the conflict. That because nuclearize the conflict means that ultimately both sides will have it. And it's not our interest, those people argue, to have a situation that both sides have it. This is a situation that would make us more vulnerable because it's not symmetrical. It's asymmetrical. Small territory, few, and essentially it's much more vulnerable. So it's not like, even if you believe in bounds of terror, you can do it when there is roughly large entities, big population, big geography, big space and all that. But this is not the case here, because the conflict itself is between small entity, almost like an island in the region. When the region is hostile, the region is larger. So those people say we should not nuclearize. And it will be a terrible mistake if our own deeds, if our own desire for security would nuclearize, because then we would be flipping our own situation and the other side will have it too, and that will be terrible. It will change the entire predicament. So ultimately it led to a compromise. The compromise was saying, we'll do technologically a great deal. Ultimately, it will be unstoppable, but we'll never say it. We'll put it in a very low profile. It's not our interest to advertise it. It's not our interest to steer. It's a way to live with it as if it's not there. So you have this extra capability that will give you a sense of security in some existential, psychological sense, but you treat it as a very extra insurance. Insurance, as some people call it, for a rainy day. And that concept ultimately became the concept. And it was also domestic fight between two camps of people. One camp was Ben Gurion and his lieutenant, people such as Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan. The others were other people who believed in conventional security and doctrine, people such as various commanders of the IDF, Yigal Allon and Galili and Yitzhak Rabin and others. So the compromise was neither side could be stopped. I mean, those people who are against to nuclearize want politically that Israel would not be the first to nuclearize, that Israel would not be like any other nuclear weapon states. Those people who wanted security and wanted to have weapons got it because Israel does have weapons, but in a way that Israel does not recognize it. And that led to a full consensus and agreement by all. This kind of compromise, and we don't talk about it, that's perhaps, and maybe we can have this monopoly for the long run, or at least for the last 50 years, and Israel was able to keep it for the last 50 years. So maybe it can work out against the view that ultimately the other side will have it. I mean, for luck, for smart, Israel was able, I mean, the only case today is Iran, and even Iran is, I mean, Iran was under the JCPOA, and there was an agreement that did not allow, I mean, some people say, including the president of this country, this is not good enough, and withdrew from that. And they said we were not going to elect Iran anyway, and we can get even better agreement than the one we had. But essentially, the last stronghold was Iran. Some people say that that maybe ultimately Saudi Arabia will try. But until now, Israel was able to keep this monopoly that initially people thought it would be very difficult to maintain. So it's a combination of tactical, strategic, political, psychological, existential elements that naturally push for this very unusual stance that became the Israeli stance. And it was protected or shielded by a deal that started almost 50 years ago in the deal between Golda Meir and President Nixon. And every American president, including Trump, has confirmed and affirmed that deal. The United States protect Israel as long as Israel keep it quiet, in the basement, under the table. And that's what you have today. There are problems with that, and if you want, we can talk about it too, but a lot of Israelis view it as a very smart way, and some Americans view it as a very smart way to have nuclear weapons. It's the best way to have nuclear weapons without dealing with pressure, without just ignoring, not acknowledging anything. Is it the best way? Well, not that obvious. There are some moral issues, there are some domestic political issues, there are some democratic issues, so it's a complex issue. But that compromise by now has become so strong that the Israeli body politics feel not only that they all support it, and they do, but they also cannot conceive otherwise to live with nuclear weapons. It seems to most Israelis, really most Israelis, as that's the only way they can live with nuclear weapons. They cannot even see in terms of imagination, acknowledging and making, so-called normalizing this issue.
So you mentioned the start of the Israeli nuclear program was really in the 1950s.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how it got started and the early French-Israeli cooperation?
Okay. I mentioned that the that the Manhattan Project was an inspiration and an image of mimicking and duplicating in the minds of Israeli leaders from the very beginning. Ben-Gurion used to say, and even he wrote it down sometimes, just as people such as Teller and Oppenheimer and others could have, all Jewish scientists were able to bring the nuclear weapons to the United States, so Israeli scientists could do the same. So in the minds of some people in Israel, it was, from the very start, heroic scientific project that Jews play a major role, and some even saw it as a project that motivated by and led by Jews. There is some partial truth to that. And for Ben-Gurion, the notion, and he was inspired by his scientist, who was not a physicist, he was a chemist, organic chemist, David Ernst Bergman, the first chairman of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, was founded secretly by Ben-Gurion in 1952. So the idea was to start to train people, to send young scientists, and they did it immediately. I mean, that notion, that hope, that sentiment that one time in the future we would like to be there, was from the very beginning. Ben-Gurion thought about it already as early as 1948, when the country was born, and the country was very, very poor. So in 1949, after the War of Independence, 6 Israeli young students, they were just left the military service. I think many of them served in what at the time it was called a Science Corps, which was a way to use young scientists or students in science for various kinds of technological, at that time, today we treat it like primitive, various kind of explosive and development of munitions and mortars, but some of those people who were talented were sent overseas to study nuclear physics. And the hope was they will come back, they will get a PhD, and they will be the first cadre to use them for national purposes, to have, possibly they will have a teaching job somewhere, but they will be. All of them became well-known scientists. Some of them were very prominent scientists. They were not really interested in, they did not, some of them did not even, perhaps the most prominent one of them, Amos the Shalit, did not even believe that Israel was capable at the time to move seriously into a nuclear project. So the nuclear project has to be weighted, even though the leaders, especially Bergman, he really wanted to have it early on. But some of the scientists, the younger scientists, younger than him in about 15 years, thought he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a dreamer who doesn't even know science, relevant science, good enough to make a judgment.
Right.
So even though the inspiration for a nuclear project started very early on, essentially in 1948-49, in the mind of the leader and the mind of his scientific advisor, Bergman, the chemist, and ultimately Ben-Gurion authorized Bergman in 1952 to create, at the Ministry of Defense, Atomic Energy Commission, a way to get knowledge, to send people and all that. Seriously, there was very little there except hope and desire. They came back, they do some experiment. There was a survey whether the country has uranium. Very little. Some perhaps could be extracted from phosphates in the Negev. But in 1955, Ben-Gurion left politics and left public life in late 53 for 2 years. When he came back in 55, he is determined to do it second time in a very serious way. From hope, from desire, from something abstract to start a real project. It so happened that this was after President Eisenhower's speech, Atom for Peace. That speech essentially led to the big conference in Geneva, the first with thousands of scientists declassifying of material, the idea of using nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. So in 1955, Ben-Gurion came back to power, and he decides to move it from hope into something concrete. I mentioned that this was following the Eisenhower speech, the Atom for Peace. The idea was to make available the peaceful side of atomic energy, to make it available to other nations, to sell reactors, small reactor, research reactor, use it for various kinds of peaceful purposes, medicine, agriculture, and other things. And the Israeli thought that could be a context that would allow them to get it. Very soon they realized that with the United States, even at the time there was not a full system of safeguard, the limited system of safeguard, they realized that via that channel, they would not go anywhere. But Shimon Peres, who was the third person and perhaps ultimately would become the most instrumental person in the Israeli nuclear program, and he was young, he was not a scientist, he was manager, administrator with strong political inspiration, political ambitions. And he felt that that project, he could find a way to stimulate such a project. It will be also a way to push his own career. It will be technology and science. And he thought, he started already to make connections in France for conventional weapons to Israel. And he found in France a receptive, scientific, administrative, political, and military networks of people who are friendly to Israel and who are open and friendly to the idea of joining interest. And at that point, France itself has not made a final decision to go, political decision to go for nuclear weapons. So he learned there that you can make various kinds of small, bureaucratic, technocratic, technological and political decision not being approved at the high political level, national level, that ultimately would lead you to have a nuclear weapons full program without calling it by name. So ultimately, by looking at the situation, the political situations around the development of nuclear weapons in France, it was for France, it was for Peres, the way that he learned how to manage politically the creation of nuclear weapons without dealing with the friction, the political frictions of the oppositions. To make a lot of things quiet a lot of things to make it like a small decisions, like a small decisions about research, about allocation of resources, about money, but without making a full decision about weapons, and essentially to create a reality. France was the place that Shimon Peres learned what ultimately would become opacity or ambiguity, to create things without moving to the political, because if you move to make a big political decision, you would definitely create opposition. You don't want to deal with it. When the project is so young, fragile, small, it needs to be cultivated. You don't need to have political fights. You need to do it quietly. And that's he learned from France. And he felt that the French nuclear industry and some people at the Commissariat, including Goldschmidt and others, could be friendly to Israel for Israel to gain some capability. And even with them, they may understand what it's all about, but you don't have to call it by name weapons. But he thought that if the American technology is not going to be available, the country that we can make some deals, that we can work together, would be France, especially if Israel would inflate the little thing that it had. And there was some conversation started in the mid-50s about Israel new patents of creating uranium, extracting uranium out of phosphates, and also for heavy water. I mean, ultimately, none of these two inventions were that meaningful and that important technologically. But there was some time that there was around buzz about it. And also, I believe that the French thought that Israel, via Jewish scientists in the United States, could help France to get some atomic secrets through American scientists, American Jewish scientists. I have doubts how much in reality that worked. Essentially, we talk about espionage, transfer of information. But I do know, because I talked to many French people, that there was this magic belief that some American doors could be magically open and some secrets could come to France via the Israelis. Ultimately, it led after some kind of negotiation. In particular, there was one important moment, and that's the collusion between Israel, France, and the UK in the Suez campaign. That's October, November 1956. There was Soviet threats against all three of them, but essentially both France and Israel did not have at the time nuclear weapons, and the determination that only in France, essentially it was under those threats that came from the Soviet Union, from Bulgarin, the French nuclear weapon was born, and in a more limited way, the Israeli nuclear weapons, if not born, was promoted heavily towards about to be born. The actual deal, Israeli leaders Peres and Golda Meir, as a foreign minister, flew to Paris, discussed what to do, and essentially they both have nothing to do in terms of protecting themselves against those threats, Soviet threat. The threats proved to be essentially bluff, but it was a very political, unique moment that helped to give birth to this nuclear program. The deal between Israel and France was ultimately signed in September 1957, and within a year or so, the French were very instrumental, very much involved in terms of engineers, in terms of designs, in creating the complex in the Negev and outside of Dimona. Later on, it's be called the Negev Nuclear Complex Research Center, and with the most well-known, of course, is the reactor. The most secretive part of that was reprocessing plant that was from the very beginning planned to be part of that. So this was the deal that Peres did in late September 1957, and this is the beginning, the real beginning of the Israeli nuclear project.
And were French political leaders supportive of that at the time?
Some did, some were hesitant. Perez, in a very Perezian way, he got a deal essentially literally hours after the French government lost confidence, and he was changing the date on the documents just to fit it as if the legitimate government could sign it. They signed it after they were already illegitimate. So there was even a little trickery involved in that, some would say even deception. And this was when the deal was born. Later on, it took years until Perez told the story. When, I think in the last 10 years of his life, he was reasonably open about that. But this was the beginning of Dimona. In parallel, in other parts of the Israeli defense R&D establishment, they started to think about weaponization. So Dimona, its job is to the fissional material, the plutonium. The other part, Israel at that time reorganized its military R&D. By 1958, a new entity going to become a large entity called Raphael, the Hebrew acronym of the Authority for Weapons Development was born, and they were in charge of the development of the weaponized side of that project. So Dimona was in charge of fissional material. The Raphael was in charge of the weaponization part of that, and ultimately in the mid-60s they were moved together and they put together into one project.
You're here in DC this week for a panel on the nuclear dimension of the Six-Day War in 1967. Can you talk a little bit about how Israel's work on developing the atomic bomb impacted the Six-Day War?
Well, the traditional narrative of the 1960s war is a narrative of losing control and a war that created out of miscalculation and misunderstanding, a war that nobody wanted, but it was created in such a way that it led to concentration of Arab forces, Egyptian forces in the Sinai, and ultimately Israel found itself must respond, must preempt, because it could not accept, could not tolerate that. I'm not saying it's a false, but the nuclear dimension of that was for years, for decades, was tacit, was unrecognized, and frankly, it was hardly known in public. The first one to talk about it was a journalist called Aluf Ben, who gave some reference to the significance of the flight of Egyptians during the crisis of May 67, of Egyptian MiG-21 over Dimona, and the fact that Israel was quite concerned that Dimona could stimulate a crisis if Egypt would respond to that. But very little information was given in public. Later on, bits and pieces came out, and in my book 20 years ago, Israel in the Boom, I had a full chapter and I was trying to give a certain kind of nuclear dimension into that. Last year, through the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, I released quite a number of testimonies that reveal that the crisis and the war had a strong and actually twofold nuclear dimension, that even today, some of it is not fully known or fully understood. And even the information that I'm trying to bring is partial and it's still limited. But when I'm talking about the twofold aspect of the crisis, I'm referring to the fact that from 1965, Israel is concerned that Dimona could stimulate Egypt to attack. If the Egyptian would come to the recognition that Israel is about to acquire, or soon to acquire, nuclear weapons, they may take action, military action, to prevent that. To what extent it was full familiarity with Egyptian thinking, or to what extent it was actually a reflection of Israeli thinking, because that's Israel, what it did with Iraq, with Syria, it was about to do it with Iran. It's not fully clear. There was some conversation about it in Egypt in 65, 66. Possibly that's one of the issues that I hope that some of the conference from the Egyptian side, the paper would shed more light than we know. At least the top military man in Egypt at the time, second to Nasser, the president, Field Marshal Amr, was concerned about it. How much it was motivation, we're not fully clear. But it was an Israeli concern that Egypt is concerned about it and might be attacking. Therefore, first it was early on, from 1965, there was a guidance for the military intelligence to build up a plan that would allow to provide early warning in case of either intelligence or aerial signs, to pick up signs of Egyptians' intentions vis-a-vis Dimona. And that program that involved with all sorts of technological and human aspect of intelligence collection started it's called Senator, started in 1965. When the crisis started, and given those flights over Dimona, one of them was on May 17, the other one was on May 26. The view in Israel was that the crisis may be about Dimona. They didn't talk about it to the public. Israel, as I said before, there was always concern that Israeli determination to have nuclear weapons would create war and could push the other side to have its own nuclear weapon. Therefore, the public discussions about what the other side think about Dimona, because Dimona itself, the whole nuclear activity of Israel itself, was very quiet. There was also a reluctance to talk, and there was not that much knowledge what the other side think about Dimona. Most people in the other side, in Egypt, did not talk publicly about it. But the early reading of the crisis was the crisis may well be about Egypt effort. This is the time, and they're looking for excuse ultimately to attack Dimona. So that's one aspect. The concern that at the core of the crisis is the last effort of Egypt, or perhaps the serious effort of Egypt, to prevent from Israel reaching or acquiring nuclear capability. By that time, it was published without confirmation, but in the world media, that Israel might be within short time means 2 or 3 years, having some rudimentary capability. By the way, it was the case. In fact, Israel already started reprocessing probably around 65, 66. So this was one aspect. The concern of the Egypt and Israeli concern about the Egyptian concern, and the fact that this could be a cause in the Egyptian side, and Israel thought much about that in terms of protecting Dimona, in terms of alert of the Israeli Air Force to attack on Dimona. The question that Dimona might be a target, Dimona might be attacked, was greatly talked among leaders and among military leaders. The public knew nothing about it. So that's one aspect of the war. And now there is more and more information about it, including from cabinet meetings and that kind of stuff of material. The more exciting material is that indeed Israel was close to have weapons. Probably they could have rudimentary device within months from 67. Even though there was a few events in early 67 that were setback, 66, including accident. And when the crisis came up, Israel had enough visual material to try to improvise, to put together for the first time, just in case, because this was existential crisis. And, in the view of Israel at the time, 1967, during the crisis, many Israelis thought this was like an Auschwitz, because Israel is being circulated, surrounded by the Arabs who want to push the Jews, to push Israel to the sea. There was unification, or at least declaration about military unification between Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. So Israel had to deal with multi-enemy, 3 different armies, possibly providing some support even from Iraq or Saudi Arabia. So it was really viewed as the most dangerous moment in Israel history. So out of that emergency, there was this activity aimed at, during those, there was a crisis of 3 weeks that led to that war, the 1967 war. The concentration of Egypt in the Sinai started on May 14th, and the war started on June 6th. So there was a lot of stuff was going on. Some Israeli military leaders pushed to start an action to preempt. The United States told Israel not to do so. The prime minister was hesitant. And in those 3 weeks, for the first time, there was an effort to improvise a nuclear device. And a testimony of a man that I was seeking for him, but I couldn't find him during the time that I wrote Israel the Bomb. I found him a year after the book came out, 1999. Yatza, he was the liaison officer. He was at the time colonel, and he was the connection between the Israeli staff, military staff, he was a senior military person who liaisoning between the nuclear project and the other civilian defense industries and the Israeli military, the IDF military, the IDF headquarters. And he was pushing even further this preparation just in case, to prepare some capability never tested. There was a lot of hesitancy whether it's going to work or not, but he wanted to give it some kind of military meaning. So he told me, and this testimony was sealed for a long, long time. One time we tried to publish it, but it was not allowed, and he was arrested and he had to trial, but I was the one who kept the interview because I interviewed him first. And he passed away in 2014. His name was, later on he became 1-star general, Brigadier General Yitzhak Yaakov, nicknamed Yatza. And a year ago, in the 50th anniversary for the war, I published most of the interview that he gave me in 1999, a year after my book was out, in which he tells about a military plan, military operation that he conceived, and it was approved, but just as a planning, not actually to do it, in case everything else fails, as an option of last resort. The idea was to provide the prime minister if everything else fails, and there was a great deal of uncertainty. In that respect, it was a great success. Israel was able in 3 hours to destroy on the ground, just about 400 aircrafts, most of them, almost all of them on the ground, Egyptians, later on Syrian and Jordanian. But it was dependent on a lot of contingency. It was dependent that the element of surprise would work. It was dependent on the element of operational success would be there, that the issue would not compromise. The Egyptians would not be in the air, but rather all the aircraft would be on the ground. Ultimately, it was remarkably a success, but nobody could predict it's going to be a success. Even Rabin did not expect. Even the commander of the Air Force thought it was going to be even more losses. Israel ultimately lost about 20% of its Air Force, but it destroyed about 80% of the Air Forces. So the fact that there was this emergency plan to allow the Prime Minister options of unthinkable, doomsday, and the idea was not to use it again, troops, not to use it as a weapon. The idea was, in case everything goes wrong, Israel can demonstrate capability by demonstration shot, to find some location in the eastern part of the Sinai Desert, to, within short time, hours, to put together teams that bringing the wires, making connections, they're lying down in some control area, kilometer or two away from the detonation, and making connection with the Prime Minister, having approval. All this is highly, highly, highly contingent. And for a lot of people, it was just in case. It was never taken very seriously, but just in case. But from historical point of view, those preparations and the creation of this primitive device, they used to call it, it was a nickname of, I forgot exactly the word for that. I knew that, how to describe the strange way that this device looked like, because it was not really a weapon. Spider, they call it, actually. But in the mind of those people involved, tens, possibly hundreds of people or more peripheral, this was the moment that Israel crossed the line. Israel became a nuclear power. But nothing happened. The whole thing was just a plan, and ultimately there was no need for that. But it was a plan that pushed the country, even though before that there was some hesitancy. It was kind of a point of no return. Now, none of this history is well known. We talked already about limits of oral history. We have some confirmation from some sources about various elements, but the full story is still not known. And this is a testimony of a very important guy who was involved in that, but it's subjective oral testimony from one source. So I'm fully aware of the limits in terms of historical knowledge of that testimony, as precious and fascinating that testimony might be. So the conference that we're going to have tomorrow, the mini conference, is I'm going to present the introduction along the line that I'm just telling you. Somebody is going to talk about what the U.S. knew and didn't know. The U.S. knew very little about it. It's going to be Egyptian story from Egyptians, what they thought and to what extent the nuclear dimension was on their side. And an Israeli will talk on Zoom and to tell about the politics of nuclear weapons in Israel. So we hope to enrich a little bit the body of knowledge. Again, I think that much of the story is still untold. For a while, the Israeli government did not like the story come out, but now they don't really have a chance, they don't have control over that. But it's a very, I do believe by now that that crisis that led to war, that changed the Middle East, had a much stronger nuclear dimension than anybody thought. And initially people ignored that dimension at all, either didn't know or wanted to look the other way because it was taboo. So that's the meeting that we're going to have tomorrow.
Very interesting. Moving forward in time a little bit,
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the possible test with South Africa that some believe was perhaps a joint South African-Israeli nuclear test. Can you talk about that and why some people think that? And
well, I was involved in effort to try to uncover some aspect of that mysterious Vela incident happened on September 21st, 1979. The mystery is still, we still don't have a full picture. I do believe it was a low-yield Israeli test. I don't believe that South Africa was much involved, except possibly providing Israel some that space off the shore of South Africa towards essentially half the way between Antarctica and South Africa, and possibly providing some logistic support to Israel. Bill Baer of the National Security Archive and I recover some documents that give indication towards that. It's a complex and convoluted story. I don't want to go into details of all that. But the bottom line is that I believe it was a test. I believe that Israel needed some kind of confirmation, but it was also very important for them that, and again, we see the United States, if my interpretation is correct, as enabler, because it was important that nobody would have a smoking gun, and also no country would say this was a test, and the United States never said that. It remained a mystery. whether it was lack of knowledge or whether it was protection of Israel and shielding Israel. That's still not fully clear. I do believe it was ultimately a shielding of Israel. But it seemed, I mean, we have some diaries from President Carter at the time that he think it was Israel, but from his diaries, at least what was published, and he published his diaries just a few years ago, he doesn't have a smoking gun for that. So there is still a great deal of mystery.
So even President Carter wouldn't have been informed about it?
I think that by now he believed it was an Israeli test. But from some of those diaries, you know, there was a full commission that was run by Jack Ruina of MIT. They never came to a strong final conclusion. They essentially ended without firm conclusion whether it was test. They said it's probably unlikely to be a test, but they were not sure. They call it a zoo event that cannot be explained. Some other information that apparently led to a test remained classified. So there is, I mean, I think that I have some various kind of evidence to support. Some of them is indirect. I believe it was a test, and I believe that Israel needed in designing advanced weapons to have that kind of results, but it was never acknowledged by governments as a test to this day.
Thank you for the explanation. There's just been so much kind of mystery about it. Right. I was curious what your perspective was. Right. So Dimona today is still a very secure site, I would presume.
Yes. Even though it's not clear to what extent Dimona works the way like it was in the past. And I tend to believe that Dimona, the reactor, I mean, the complex is doing various things that had to do with maintenance and keeping an active arsenal. That's essentially the infrastructure of the arsenal. It's not clear to me that Israel has continued to produce full capacity of fission material the way it did 20 or 30 years ago. I have doubts. I'm not going to explain why I have doubts, but I have doubts.
So it might be relying on its past nuclear stockpile rather than building up more.
That's right.
Does Israel have a nuclear energy program as well, or is it
Not really.
It's mostly been about
Israel
the weapons?
was interested many times in possibly nuclear energy program. It always failed. I mean, first Israel could not have gone into, even though there was interest in nuclear energy, in part to disguise the real activity for weapons, Israel did not have enough sources, financial and human sources, to have two large projects at the same time. So it has to be postponed and delayed. And later on, the NPT did not allow Israel to get legitimately nuclear assistance because Israel was not part of the non-proliferation treaty. So Israel does not have, I mean, by now the pressure is much off because Israel in the last 10 years discovered a great deal of gas offshore, so reasonably cheaper, so the need to have a nuclear program is no longer pressing.
And as you mentioned, Israel is one of the only countries that hasn't signed the NPT.
That's right. In fact, there are 3 states that all of them do have nuclear weapons. It's India, Israel, and Pakistan.
Has Israel come under external or internal criticism for not being a signatory?
Right. Internally, there is, as I said, Israelis were in love with the current policy, and they know that they have nuclear weapons, and most Israelis know nothing about that treaty anyway. And the United States, the deal that was made 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago, between Golda Meir and Nixon, still valid, and the United States does not have. In fact, the Trump administration essentially adopt almost, I mean, there is no even lip service of asking Israel kind of pro forma to sign the non-proliferation treaty or to do something for a nuclear weapon-free zone. The Trump administration fully adopts the Israeli official position that the conditions are not ripe and there is no point to talk about nuclear weapon-free zone right now.
Can you provide a little more detail about the 1979 agreement between President Nixon and Golda Meir?
1969.
Sorry, 1969.
Yeah. Well, the issue was interesting because the Nixon administration was the first administration that faced the realization that Israel is becoming a nuclear weapon state. The question was what to do it. Can we do anything about it? Under Kissinger as the national security advisor, there was complex and multi-leveled bureaucratic studying and discussion what to do about it with the Pentagon, Department of State, the CIA, and at the time the AEC, later on the Department of Energy, involved in that discussions. And at the senior level of the administration, some thought that the United States should put a pressure on Israel to sign the NPT or to put some limits. Very soon they realized that Israel refused. There was an effort to put some pressure and questions to the ambassador at the time, Rabin. He shrugged off this effort and said the issue has to discuss between the president and the new prime minister, Golda Meir, President Nixon. Nixon refused to give okay to those efforts to link supply of American weapons to Israel to Israeli concessions on the nuclear side. And when the prime minister met ultimately President Nixon, I believe we don't have any record from that meeting, but we have some testimonies of other people, and we have some records after that give some hints that the deal was made that Israel is not going to change its policy. It's going to continue to say that it's not going to be the first to introduce nuclear weapons. Israel would refrain testing, would refrain keeping a high profile, would refrain announcement or declaration, and in return the United States would look the other way and would no longer press Israel to sign the NPT. A few months later, so this meeting was in late September 1969. A few months later, as Israel promised, Ambassador Rabin informed Kissinger that Israel decided not to sign, and the National Security Advisor, Kissinger, does not even say, I'm sorry, or it's regretful, or it's unfortunate, or any of that. He just reports it, passes it on to the president, and essentially he knew it was coming. So it was two-sided agreement to give Israel a very unique status. Israel would keep itself low profile, non-acknowledgement, non-testing, and the United States essentially would protect that kind of test and would put off pressure at Israel in various kind of intentional form. So in many ways, the United States became a full party to that deal. The deal, this bargain could not be done. The bargain of opacity as a policy, as a unique policy, we talked about it in the early interviews, could not be maintained by Israel alone. In a sense, the United States, not formally, but practically, is a trustee of that arrangement. So the responsibility, whether you like it or not, without strong American support, tacit support to that deal could not exist, could not survive, could not persist.
So one of the people you interviewed was Bertrand Goldschmidt, who was the only French scientist to work on the Manhattan Project in the United States. Tell us a little bit about him.
So in the summer of 92, I believe, I felt that I need to do some questioning in France. And I used a number of colleagues and friends, in particular Thérèse Delpech, who was at the time kind of Miss Nuclear Energy in France. She was involved in senior position in a number of capacities, including the commissariat. And she helped me to reach out Goldschmidt. In fact, she introduced me to Goldschmidt. So there were a few individuals. One was American Larry Scheinman. Larry Scheinman was he was involved with the legal and political aspect of the IAEA, and he did his PhD in the late 50s on the history of the French nuclear development. I think the first American book on the French nuclear history was written by Larry Lawrence Scheinman. And he had various positions in the US State Department, he was at ACDA, and including in Europe. And he knew all those people. The other individual who helped me a great deal was Therese Delpache. I knew her individually, but Larry knew her also very well. And she arranged for me a number of interviews, I think 3 interviews. The most prominent among them was with Goldschmidt, Bernhard Goldschmidt. I met him at the commissariat. This was in 1992. He was already, I think he was well into his mid or late 80s. And yet he was coherent, and talking to him I realized some of the limits about oral history. He remembered well some aspects. Goldschmidt was one of the pioneers, as you know very well, of the French commissariat. He was one of the scientists who was in Quebec, and he was involved in various processes. He's a chemist. He was interested in history, but also he was one of the French pioneers of their development in the 50s. By 1956-57, he was the head of the external relations part of the commissariat. He was the chief diplomat so there was no way to avoid him. And he, on the one hand, he was supportive of Israel, but I think he was not completely certain whether it's right for France to provide Israel the full assistance for weapons. So I met him, and he told me a great deal of his memory. The memory was he remembered certain things and he didn't remember other things. And I think that you can see it in the interview itself, that he tells me about the atmosphere of some meetings and the attitude of some people, but he doesn't have that much meat in his memory. I talked to him 30 years later. So we talked about things that happened between 56, 57, 58. I was sitting when he was a man of probably mid-late 40s, and I was sitting with him in 1992. So this was almost 40 years later. But there was a sense that first he was understanding the issue of proliferation and the dangers, at the same time how this technology would be spread. On the Israeli thing, it was clear that he was ambivalent, being a Jew, at least partly Jewish. He had sympathy, but he also had some doubts whether it's right for France to provide that much assistance. And the fact that even above him, at the level of the head of the commissariat and the head of some of the ministers and the prime minister, there was some hesitancy. Some supporting, but there was some hesitancy.
Since we're on the topic of France's nuclear program, what can you tell us about why France decided to develop a nuclear weapon? You mentioned earlier that the Suez Crisis.
The Suez Crisis was a major turning point. The conviction that France to keep its status, especially after the humiliation, there was another important point. That's the humiliation that happened in Indochina, especially Dien Bien Phu, when the France has to desert and had so many losses. And if we had tactical nuclear weapons, we could have saved those soldiers. We didn't have to be humiliated. And the view that for a country that used to be colonial power, even if they're losing their colony, to maintain a certain kind of image, they need to have nuclear weapons, was there much before de Gaulle. Well, de Gaulle supported that, and he would develop into the French grandeur the notion that for the greatness of France must distinguish itself with having nuclear weapons. Politically, the communists in France that were a strong part of the body politics, domestic politics, they did not want to go nuclear. So there was hesitancy and not fully clarity about what political decision to go. But there was groups of technocrats, of nuclear industry people. They wanted to have infrastructure for weapons, and various people develop and proven cultivating that idea, that activity. It was Gimole in the context of the Sinai crisis, the Suez crisis, that crossed. And I think the final decision was made short time before about a year before they actually detonated. And of course, it was de Gaulle with the Fifth Republic who took the final decision to go further and to have a certain kind of special doctrine that fits French needs, especially its independence, especially its being outside NATO and all that kind of things.
When did France test its first nuclear weapon?
Well, this was in the Algeria in 1916, February 1916, Regain. That's well known. There was a series of nuclear weapons tests. The last one was under the concern that there was some rebels within the French military about Algerians, and and France was about to leave Algeria, so the whole thing became kind of less and less secure. Ultimately, French moved that kind of test site into the Pacific, but the first one was in February 1960. And there is a strong rumor, I tend to believe it's true, that Israeli scientists might have been present during the first test. And this was part of because the least known aspect of French-Israeli nuclear cooperation was on weaponization and on some cooperation on actually weapons design. And I believe as part of that agreement, it may have been, there are strong rumors that some Israeli senior scientists were observing the first French tests in the Sahara. Israel wanted very much to get the reprocessing technology from France, and the example was the fact that France was able to establish its own capability, the famous facility in Marcoule, France. That was the place where French work on reprocessing was done for many, many, many years. And it was apparently a smaller version of Marcoule that was built underground in the Dimona, built in from the very beginning as part of the Israeli project. And this was the key factor of the project, that the Americans for years and years and years did not know whether firmly it exists or doesn't exist, or to what extent, what's the size of that capability.
Yeah, it's interesting that Israel and France had at least some cooperation, considering the French had some resentment toward the U.S. for not giving it more information after the Manhattan Project. Same with England.
That's right. And Israel appeared to be as if Israel could open certain kind of doors that France itself could not open. To these days, I don't believe that this is almost 60, almost more than 60 years since that cooperation started, 56, today 2018. I don't believe that the full story of the French-Israeli nuclear cooperation is known. I think, and very few documents were released. The French is still, and as you know, French is a country that is committed to nuclear secrecy almost as much as Israel, almost.
How much information does France reveal today about its nuclear stockpile?
My understanding is very limited. I mean, we know something about submarines and missiles, but it's very limited. And French people, society don't ask too many questions. I mean, we know much less about France than we know, for example, about the UK. I think the UK is the most open country. France, Israeli side, is the most closed. I mean, talking about democracies, Western democracies.
If you could talk about some of your current projects and current research.
Well, I see myself as more nuclear historian than nuclear analyst or policy. I mean, I have a strong interest in policy, but my real interest is historian. I have interest in the questions of, in the American case, the questions of relationship between leaders and the bomb. In the particular, in the American context, in the context of the president and the bomb, the unique arrangement that the president alone is the one who can authorize use of nuclear weapons. Alex Wallerstein and I received a small contribution from Plowshare to start a project in that way, and we did a workshop on this issue. And we hope to apply for larger funding and to continue with both historical and policy-related activity on this issue.
There does seem to be a lot of misunderstanding among the public. Many people seem to think that Congress has to authorize the president to use nuclear weapons, which of course is not true.
Not the case, of course.
So that's the sort of thing you're trying to
Yes.
combat against.
Yeah. And to think what kind of changes involved. I don't believe much in legislative changes. I believe more in structural, organizational, and doctrinal changes. And of course, some of this concern came out because of the current president we have, in the sense of lack of satisfaction with the impulsive nature of that president. So what to do with, in general, impulsive president, erratic president. So that's the source of some of that interest.